Good evening, everyone. City Council Committee on Community and Economic Development, co-posted with the Committee of the Whole, is meeting tonight in Council Chambers, being July 6, 2026, at 6 p.m. For the purposes of discussing the matters, notice for this meeting was posted on June 29, 2026, at 9:47 a.m. Absent from City Council is Councilor Hapworth and Councilor Varela. All other councilors present. Subject matter tonight is rent stabilization resolution, resolution that was brought forward in last council meeting by Ward 5 Councilor King. We will be having a presentation by the Executive Director of Homes for All Ages, Homes for All Massachusetts, Ms. Carolyn Chu. Also present in the audience is former Ward 5 Councilor Jeff Cohen. So I will now turn it over to our good Ward 5 Councilor Lydia King.
Thank you, Chair Prosnewski. So just to recap for folks that are either joining us in the audience and for councilors on what we're discussing tonight, we have in front of us a resolution to urge support for rent stabilization to protect tenants and preserve our neighbors, preserve our community in Salem. This resolution was read in full at our most recent council meeting, so I'm not going to reread it for the sake of time. If it is pushed out of this committee meeting with a positive recommendation, it will be read in full again at Thursday's meeting, so there'll be another opportunity to hear it as well. I will just to give like a high-level overview, in the whereas statements of the resolution, it really explains the rising cost of living in Salem. Rent prices on average have gone up about almost 35% in the last 5 years. Lots of Salem renters are cost burdened. 51% of Salem renter households spend over 30% of their income on rent, and 30% of Salem households spend over half of their income on rent. And this leads to just generally lots of instability in our communities and neighbors who can no longer stay our neighbors because they're no longer able to afford to live here. So in general, that explains the context, and then it gets into the therefore be it resolved section of the resolution, which essentially expresses support for the state legislation. The state legislation going through the State House would effectively lift the statewide ban on rent stabilization policies with some parameters. We'll learn a little bit more about that tonight, what those parameters are like, but that is what it is. It's essentially a local option bill that would put the power to make decisions about rent stabilization back in the hands of cities and towns in Massachusetts. Obviously, I'm in favor of rent stabilization as a policy, otherwise I wouldn't have brought this in. But even for councilors who are more on the fence of policy, at the end of the day, this is about us having the power to make decisions for ourselves. Whether or not you agree with this policy, us asking for the power to make our own decisions, I think is an important thing for us to do as a community. With that, I will invite Ms. Carolyn Chu from Homes for All Massachusetts, the Executive Director of Homes for All Massachusetts, to come up and just talk a little bit more about this. We had in this council meeting that we wanted to just think through and talk through, so I thought this would be great. Thank you.
Before we do that, though, I just want the public to know how tonight's agenda is going to work. Ms. Chu is going to give us a presentation. Councilors will get a chance to discuss and have questions answered. When the presentation is done and council is done, they're going to open it up to public comment, and we'll take it from there. Okay, thank you. Ms. Chu, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you to the chair and to the committee for having me. Let me just screen share. All right. And I will just use these slides as framing, but also we'll just share and really want to answer questions. Homes for All Massachusetts is a coalition of tenant organizing groups across the state. We have Lynn United for Change on the North Shore and are supporting groups across the region and across the state, right? We hear stories of tenants being priced out from Pittsfield to the Cape, and all of our gateway cities, we're in a real crisis, like Lydia talked about. like Councilor King talked about, my apologies. And Massachusetts, as you all know, is in a severe affordable housing crisis. Massachusetts renters, if they were not rent burdened, would have $4 billion that they would be spending in our local economies. And over 50% of renters across the state spend more than a third of their income on rent. And the annual household income needed to afford a 2-bed rental in the state is $93,000. Certainly in eastern Massachusetts, that's far higher. And like, Councilor King mentioned, we're losing residents due to rental costs in all of our gateway cities. And yeah, I won't use all of these, but just to say, right, it's disproportionately, people of color are disproportionately impacted by this rental crisis. And so, we know that this is an issue of racial justice, of equity, right, in our cities and towns. But yes, you all have been talking about that. And I guess just to say, before I get into the policy details, that, I think it is important to say we are not saying that rent stabilization alone is going to solve our housing crisis. There is no silver bullet to solve our housing crisis, unfortunately. We need to do everything we can, and we need to build more housing, and our residents cannot wait for us, for that building to happen. When we see, crisis day after day, we see tenants being priced out of their units, being evicted for no cause. So we like to say, this is a set of interconnected crises, including a shelter system that's struggling to have the money to support families and individuals. Lack of affordable housing across the state, exclusionary zoning laws, particularly in suburbs, tenants facing high rent increases and no-fault evictions, and we continue to see low-income and middle-income homeowners face foreclosure. So, there's even more to say, but I think it's just important to say we believe rent stabilization is a key tool in the toolbox that cities and towns should have the ability to enact, but is not the only thing we need to do. And we are excited to support the council and support Salem in many different avenues to continue to take on the housing crisis. So, what has our campaign been? I'm going to talk about, it's a little complicated. I know that's why I'm here. There was the ballot question, which was struck down by the Supreme Judicial Court, but was still kind of, sparked a lot of conversation. Then there's our bill, which I'll talk about, that's in the State House that both Senator Lovely and Representative Cruz have co-sponsored. And then there's the compromise we worked on, actually with a lot of support from Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, with representatives of the real estate industry. So I'm going to kind of walk you through all of those, but I think for the purpose of, this resolution, we're really talking about the issue and keeping the issue front and center. Because I would say the thesis is like the ballot question sparked a lot of, I think, important conversation. There were a lot of differences with different people on the policy as it stood in the ballot. And so, but it did allow us to have these conversations toward a compromise. And we believe that the need for rent stabilization has not gone away because of a Supreme Judicial Court ruling on a technicality. And we think that now is the time for the legislature to continue to take action to allow cities and towns to enact this policy. And, we'll continue on that through the end of this legislative session this month, and then, if needed, into 27, 28. So, like we really think this is about people, everyday people, our residents versus corporate real estate investors who are driving up the housing costs and making it impossible for residents to make ends meet. And we really see this, across the board, but particularly seniors in a lot of our gateway cities are seeing huge rent increases. In central Massachusetts, we're working with a set of seniors who, many of them downsized out of their houses they owned into a kind of apartment complex, and then a new owner bought their building and doubled their rent. So these are the kinds of things we see. Lynn United for Change and ECHO see that across the region here. That's a kind of issue. Single moms who, a new person buys their building and suddenly the rent is 3 times, and that is an impossible choice for anyone to make. So, as I said, we kind of had these two paths. We had the ballot initiative and the legislative campaign. We are continuing to pursue the legislative campaign. But, the ballot, I think, helped move the conversation along and just showed how much energy there was. I mean, we got 200,000 signatures between the 2 rounds across the state of voters who are ready for this to be enacted. And it just showed, like, at every supermarket, at every mall, there were so many people who were eager to sign, because this is a key part of how we can keep Massachusetts affordable. Okay, so I think I'm going to skip the ballot language and just go to what was on the legislative bill, which is on my right, perhaps. Yes, I don't know for people online, but the ballot campaign, like Councilor King said, was statewide, but the bill is local option. So meaning it lifts, fundamentally what we're trying to do is lift the ban on rent control in Massachusetts and allow for local municipalities to vote on a local rent control measure. Our bill, which is S1447 H2328, limits it would kind of allow cities and towns to opt into a policy that limits annual rent increases to the cost of living with a cap of 5%, exempts owner-occupied buildings with 4 or fewer units, and exempts new construction for first 5 years, and bans no-fault evictions, and says you have to have a reason to evict tenants. So this is kind of the bones of the vehicle that we are using to talk about rent stabilization. So you may think that it should be 10 years or 15 years on the new construction. I would say, like, those are really live conversations, but I would imagine that, like many elected officials who supported this, we really see this as a vehicle to talk about local option rent stabilization, and a meaningful local option rent stabilization that does cap rents at a meaningful rate for tenants, so they don't see their rents go up way above what they can afford, while we continue to, support new housing production and support small landlords. So I'll just say then this compromise legislation, as you all probably have heard about, was months of conversations with industry stakeholders, so real estate stakeholders, Homes for All Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Association of Community Development Corporations, which includes, leadership from folks like Andrew DeFranza at Harbor Light, and other folks in your region. And we really got to work with some developers to talk about, both for-profit and nonprofit, to talk about their concerns around the policy as it stood kind of in the bill, as well as the ballot question. And I should say the policy as it stood in the ballot question, actually, and kind of how we could address some of those concerns while still addressing this critical issue of tenants who are just not able to stay in their apartments or homes. So, this led us to a compromise version, which includes, so you can see it's the green, and this is comparing to the ballot, not to the bill, just to say. I apologize, I was putting some different slides together on that, but this would cap CPI, it would be CPI plus 5 with a cap of 10 for the annual rent increase. Still local option. In this compromise, tenants would be allowed to increase the rent more between tenancies, basically to as much as they want. And because of that, it was important to us to keep those tenant protections. So what I talked about around needing a reason to evict, because our concern, when we said, oh, we don't want landlords to be able to increase rents exorbitantly between tenants, that was not an ideological position we were taking. Our concern was if you can only raise the rent so much on a current tenant, but then a new tenant moves in, but a new tenant you could raise the rent to market or whatever you then could absorb, the unit could absorb, then it might incentivize you to evict for no fault the current tenant so that you can just increase the rent on the next person. So we wanted to address that, right? Again, and I think we had some really important conversations with developers who were saying, well, we still need to be able to evict, and we said yes, but how do we solve for this problem that if we limit the rent increase for one tenant but not between tenants, it could create some bad incentives. So that was where we really started to talk again about banning no-fault evictions. and tenant protections. This compromise legislation also clarified the process for above cap increases for capital improvements, and went to 15 years on the new construction exemption, and then added some additional clarifying the kind of subsidized housing exemptions and some other pieces. So this never became a new version of the bill, but we just wanted to say, like, we have been in active conversations that are not just about, kind of the bill text as it stands, but really, I think your support of the bill and of, some form of a compromise is really talking about, like, we are, Homes for All has been willing to really move and address concerns, but we need this issue to stay live, because the issue of tenants being forced out of their units because of high rent increases is live every day, and we really want the issue to be front and center. It's not going to go away just because of a Supreme Judicial Court ruling, and so, I think to share both the original bill language and the compromise hopefully allows you all to see there's a lot of room for this policy to shift a little bit still, but I think keeping the issue front and center is really critical, and something that, we're grateful the council is considering. So those are, that's kind of my basic presentation, and happy to answer questions about any of those pieces. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Jewett, and very nice. Very well done. Councilor King.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify, so what you're basically saying by calling S1447H23 vehicle, it sounds like, well, this is the original version that was proposed. The compromise items that you showed on the next slide, basically the State House is working out what of those compromise items they might include, and that would all show up as amendments to the existing bill.
It could, or, as a State House process, it could just show up in a different vehicle in the State House, but I think, we have continued to ask representatives and senators to co-sponsor our bill. The Senate version just got out of committee and went to Ways and Means this week, so yes, exactly. We're saying that this is kind of the initial vehicle, and there's a room. We have done a lot of work to address additional concerns, and there's room for us to move that, like you said.
And I will just note, I think that is kind of new and exciting information that Senator Lovely has co-sponsored the bill, because she had mentioned verbally support of it a few weeks ago, and then since we had our last meeting, she has actually co-sponsored it even after the ballot question got taken off of the ballot.
Yes, she had co-sponsored it previously, but I think had been supportive. I don't want to speak for her and have not talked to her that much about it, but I believe was supportive of, like many of the our Senate champions have been supportive of any sort of compromise work we can do to move the issue along.
Councilors, any further questions? Councilor Smith.
Thank you, Chair. On that last slide, if you would go back to that, so the compromise bill would include things on the left. So I guess my question is actually the only one that maybe is different is the last one. Would it still include the exemptions for owner?
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Exactly. Sorry.
Exemptions for short-term rentals. We don't like that. Well, I guess it makes sense. We get that another way. But it would still include the educational and religious institution exemption?
Yes. Thank you for clarifying. That is the one slide where, right, the new exemptions are additional. Some of the other ones, like you said, are changing. So yeah, we have not moved on owner-occupied for fewer units. Short-term rentals, we, are supportive of other regulations to things like Airbnb, but, felt it's a different scheme and heard from some of the folks on the Cape and other regions that there's some, there's different ways people need to regulate that. And then education, religious institutions, meaning like dorms and nunneries and monasteries. That's really what we're talking about. The concern from the Supreme Judicial Court was not about whether that's allowed in a rent stabilization policy. It's simply whether that's allowed to be on a ballot. So we don't see any concern with that. And it's very standard in rent stabilization policies to exempt religious institutions. And also, actually, it's not listed here, but I should say also elder care facilities, just because they're not traditional tenancies. like an elder care facility with services, may be an exorbitant cost for many folks who have had to deal with that, but it's just not a traditional tenancy similar to a nunnery or something on a religious institution.
That makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was mostly concerned with the owner occupied under 4 units, just because there are a lot of people that mention that and they say, oh, well, it's not in the bill because it might, it actually is, I believe, in SB 14.
Yeah.
But they might miss that portion. And so it's important to probably have that, because we do have a lot of folks that are like that in Salem. Just because it is such a high cost of living, people are living on one floor and renting out another one, and that's how they survive. So thanks.
And on that, I'll just say, the other piece is part of the reason that's the way we've written the exemption is we feel, even if you're a small landlord and you have a few properties, that you are running a small business to some extent, and we do, we think then are operating as a small business and can operate within the parameters. If you just own a 2-family, like you really are that's your house that you happen to have a second unit in, and we do feel that's like a different relationship than, we want to support small landlords, but we believe that this kind of scheme is really workable for a small landlord who would not be exempt. Our goal is to make a scheme that is both workable for people who, it's not a punishment, right? It's just a limitation, but then for people who are actually like small landlords living in their home, then, we want them to give them more flexibility if they need to replace the roof or do something like that.
Thank you so much.
Councilor Lapa.
Thank you, Chair Prosnowski. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for giving us this presentation. Quick, I don't think this is super detailed question about the policy. So I understand a lot of the details are still in discussion, but hypothetically, if this passes in some form from the State House and is signed into law, can you speak to what options municipalities will have at that point? Like, is that percentage cap fixed, or is that something that's a maximum? Are some of these details that are being worked out negotiable when it comes to the city, or are those going to be hard limits?
As both versions are currently written, we're imagining it's a bit of a policy that is then enacted by the city and town. We've debated some of that. I will say we do think that probably having like 50 different versions would be quite difficult for developers or landlords who might be in multiple municipalities. So we have started to lean toward having kind of an opt-in, opt-out, making sense to and also to allow EOHLC, the Housing Livable Communities Office, and others to set regulations and support cities and towns to enact, because we know that cities and towns should have choice, but also have limited capacity to enact these policies, and we think it could be helpful, but certainly open to more discussion about that.
Thank you.
Councilor Sidoriak.
Thank you, Chair Prosnowski, and thank you for your presentation. Just kind of a point of clarification, for the compromise bill, what is the bill number?
So there is no bill number, there's language, and I think we've just been referencing it as, a common sense compromise, and this is kind of as we originally presented that, and again, we see the vehicle as the bill as written.
So how long would it take to get it? I mean, what is the process?
Yeah, there's language. I guess we've been saying compromise to say, to your question as well, it may not look exactly like this, but this is some of the character of what we believe is a reasonable compromise between the concerns of developers and the concerns of tenant advocates. In legislative terms, they can replace bill language in full or in part. They, as the S1447 moves forward, a new language that it looks more like this could be kind of just replaced within the process.
How much longer in the session for that?
Till the end of July.
And then is there someone that is willing to, what is the likelihood that this information?
I think that there continues to be enthusiasm to get some form of rent stabilization done, because if not, we will just be in the same conversation for another legislative cycle. It's now in Ways and Means, so it would be up to the chair of Ways and Means in the Senate to do that, and we've been talking to leadership in the House and Senate, or again, it can also be put into another bill vehicle.
So there's not really either the actual bill or the language and we don't really know what it is going to look like this iteration for this session?
Well, we did just get out of committee, which is the first step, so then you're in Ways and Means, and then that's where they can then take it to the floor. So we have 3 weeks for that to happen.
And so what does that process look like? Like is there first passage, second passage? Is there a possibility it goes back to a committee?
It won't go back to a committee, yeah, once in the State House bills just move forward, so it goes out of committee, it goes to Ways and Means if it has anything to do with the budget, and then they make a recommendation, so Ways and Means will poll bills, and then if they want to, it'll move forward to the full floor, to the full body.
So there's a
I think there's a lot of uncertainty with how the rest of the session will play out in general around housing policy right now. I'll say I think there's a lot of appetite for more to be done on housing that we're hoping that the state legislature will take up. But I think that, again, like the Salem City Council taking this on and saying this is a key issue is going to be really important to us, helping move the issue forward for the next few weeks in session.
And then, so I'm just curious, if this doesn't go through, do you know of any champions within the legislature that would take this on into the next session?
Yeah, we definitely intend to continue moving forward in the next session. Our current sponsors are Representative Montano from Jamaica Plain in Boston, Representative Rogers from Arlington, Cambridge, and Senator Pat Jalen, who's retiring senator from Somerville, Cambridge, Winchester, I believe. And because she's retiring, we are, continuing to look for new additional champions. I'm sorry, Senator Adam Gomez from Springfield is our other Senate champion. So Senator Gomez will continue, and someone else will join her. So, I mean, we think this issue, we've heard a lot of, feedback from the Senate as well as the House that everyone knows this continues to be an issue. And again, if we don't move forward in this session, I mean, getting out of committee and getting to Ways and Means in the state legislature is a step that allows you to then move into the next session with some more momentum behind you.
And, I'm just about city council, that's moved out of Ways and Means. Other chamber, does it follow it, or does that?
Oh, good question. So yes, we were in different committee. The state legislature changed their rules this session so that the bills don't have to be on the same track in the House and the Senate. So in the Senate, we were in municipalities, the municipalities committee. In the House, we were in housing. So the House bill has been moved to rules, which is a different path if it doesn't need to go to Ways and Means, and in the Senate, they've moved it to Ways and Means. They're on different tracks, but they're both out of their initial committee and still, they haven't been sent to study, as they say.
Okay, so they're essentially like...
Right, they're kind of in parallel play. Yes, yeah. Same barriers, same opportunities, yeah.
Thank you.
Council Flynn?
Thank you, Chair. Not being a member of the committee through you, I can definitely see why this work is progressing, why the Ward 5 councilor did this. But I had a couple questions and concerns if this did happen. Just doing some research on this, some concerns that I had, problems in the past with rent control. Have you considered property owners that might neglect property if this goes through where they're limited, is one of my questions.
Sure. This is really not like the rent control schemes of the past that Boston and Cambridge and Brookline had. There's no rent board that's kind of setting the limit every year. This is really about predictability for landlords and for tenants. So we don't believe in these kind of modern schemes. You see some of that, and we also contend with some of the research around that. But generally, putting that aside, I do think we believe these more modern schemes that have just a set cap tied to inflation are more predictable for both the landlords and the tenant.
Okay. Another question I had was, how about the concern of people like in Salem that might be frustrated if this went through and decide, you know what, we're just going to get rid of our units, we're going to do condo conversions? Is there a concern that something like this could actually hurt the amount of rental units in Salem. Follow what I'm saying?
I think that, well, one thing is, condo conversion ordinances are things that municipalities can take on. So we do encourage, like Airbnb, there are ways without a home rule for that conversation to be open here in the city of Salem. But in addition, I think, we just believe it's like one piece of the puzzle. So we think, yes, we still need to build more housing. We need to get more rental units online. And I don't think that, we don't believe that this is going to, impact that. This is really just going to be a way to make sure that tenants don't get their rent like jacked up exorbitantly.
Last question.
Yeah.
If this looks like it possibly could go through, is there a concern that some landlords might jack the rent right up right away? So it's a basis.
Yeah.
A start, you know what I mean? You
Yeah.
can see immediate increases.
Absolutely.
Because they're going to be concerned where they
Yeah.
could be limited in the future. I mean, that's got to be a concern.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to see the rent is protected.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that we already saw that. Honestly, in December and January, we were seeing landlords do that just because of the specter of the ballot question. And that is a concern for us, but I think it actually demonstrates why we need a policy like this. Our bill and any of the compromise drafts we have all have some period, like 6 months before, kind of a base rent being like 6 months before the policy's enacted, so that to try to avoid some of that concern. Because yeah, I think it's tricky because we see that, and to me it also speaks to why this is important, because right now it's totally legal for landlords to just do that.
That's all I have for you. I just don't want to see us make it worse for the renters.
Yeah.
Where, you know what I mean? There could be fallout. For every action, there's a reaction. And that's why I'm carefully with this and considering things that could go wrong.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And, and again, as these policies progress, more regulations will have to be written. I think we've done a good job really playing out a lot of scenarios. And part of why, we see this as more of an opt-in, opt-out is it gives us a little more opportunity to work with EOHLC to do regulations that can cover any municipality that chooses to enact.
Council President Merkel.
Thank you, Chair Prosnewski, not being a member of the committee. And I also want to say thank you for the presentation. And I've really appreciated all the discussion that this resolution, the proposed ballot question, the pending state legislation, has prompted. Like you had said, it has sparked, important conversation, and the work that went into the ballot question and the support it had before being struck down. It shows that people really want to see more action taken by their government to address the housing crisis and the skyrocketing rents. I will say I do understand the risks to housing production, that rent stabilization can have. I've heard from those concerns from people that are knowledgeable about housing, and that anything, considered by Salem down the road would need to be carefully crafted with that in mind. Like you said, I liked what you had just said. I can't remember verbatim about, examining the different scenarios, like in the last, the counselor's questions. And I think the conversations, and the compromise bill is looking at that as well, and the conversation that's going on tonight. So, I'll say what I like in the resolution is its support for legislation, that allows cities and towns local control, to have these conversations and decide what actions we feel would work best, for our communities collectively having those conversations. So honestly, I'm not sure what specifics I'd support, but regardless, I feel, we as a municipality should have the option to hash through that, is my feelings, like getting educated with, everything you went over tonight, the questions, and Councillor King's, all the data and that she has included as well. So, yeah, I would like to see us have the freedom to take, the path that we collectively feel is best for Salem. Thank you.
And can I just say, just on the production piece, just because you brought it up, and I did not say as much about it, perhaps, we're happy to share more, and through Councillor King, but some of the studies that have been kind of the biggest flags around production, we believe just aren't looking at not looking that longitudinal. Like, yes, like you were saying, something like rent stabilization is going to have some short-term impact as things settle, right? But, in Montgomery County, Maryland, in St. Paul, Minnesota, in these counties or municipalities, we did see some impact to production in a short period, but then, like in Montgomery County, Maryland, they saw a full rebound, within a year. So I think sometimes, like, some of the studies that have come out, like the tough study that was done this earlier this year, that our opposition has referenced, our concern is just that's spreading a very short term, like a few month concern, and then projecting it to go out in the same exact trajectory over, years. And we just think, we need to be looking at longitudinal data around real estate markets do fluctuate. Yeah.
You still have the floor, Councilor.
Thank you.
President.
Yes, that's exactly, what I've been thinking about and reading, from people who reached out. And I did notice that, the ballot question, the numbers seemed, quite restrictive, and the compromise bill, it doesn't seem, as stringent. And it seems like it would be less restrictive for new developments. So, and like I said, I'm not even sure what I would land on, but all of that is really, what you just said is helpful. And that's, there's a lot to look at. And I think, making that point with what you just said, the studies, the data, and how it's played out in other areas will be helpful as well. So I appreciate all of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Davis.
Thank you, Chair Presnewski. Not being a member of the committee, thank you so much for the presentation. And I think kind of walking us through the compromise bill really kind of helps to contextualize the conversation too, so I appreciate that. I don't have a question, just wanted to share some thoughts, so apologies there. But yeah, I mean, I think on the question of kind of the uncertainty of what's going to happen in the legislature, right, I think that's precisely why it's so important that we're talking about this resolution, so important that communities, like ours, pass things like this to, keep up that pressure and really make a statement that we want to see, something happen. We want those conversations to continue and that compromise to happen. So, I dug a lot in this past week into a lot of the studies that are out there. I know you spoke to that a little bit because, the question of would this impede housing production, I think, would be a huge concern for me as someone who believes like we desperately need more housing. And I've seen, and studied a lot of the research out there of the effect that, increased housing production can have on, reducing housing costs. So I dug into that. I have to say I found a lot of studies that really pointed in the opposite direction. Actually, the most extensive body of research on rent stabilization comes from New Jersey, where dozens of municipalities implemented rent control in the late 20th century. They found no statistically significant difference in the rates of new housing construction between rent-controlled and non-rent-controlled municipalities. I thought that was really interesting. There was a study from UC Berkeley Haas Institute report, which found that rent regulations which permit annual increases indexed to inflation, which is what we're talking about here, the bill in the legislature, that allow landlords to pass through capital improvement costs, do not impede new housing development. Some of the articles about unintended consequences of rent control often point to, and you mentioned what happened in St. Paul. It's important to note that, and in that case, they did experience a drop in housing production. As you noted, there was a rebound, but that was incredibly more restrictive. There was a 3% annual cap, right? That's very different than what we're talking about, right? And that is frequently kind of pointed to in a lot of the articles that talk about how problematic this might be, which I think might be a little bit misleading to readers. So I think at the end of the day, like, we need more evidence, right? And I think that's exactly what passing this resolution, having the ban lifted at the state level would provide, right? We would see communities, maybe one starting, that already had rent control at one point, like Boston, Cambridge, implement this. We would see data from that, and then we could have a data-driven conversation and decision, which I think is the only kind of responsible way to go about this. So I just want to urge the other counselors, right? Like, we don't in this room have to decide our whole and complete thoughts about whether we want rent control in Salem today, because that's not what we're voting on, right? And that's a conversation for another time. It's precisely what the Ward 5 counselor talked about lifting that cap and having options for folks. And I really like that you use the language of there's no silver bullet, right? Because I think that's just so important to always come back to, right? As I said, I believe in the value of housing production. It is not a catch-all, right? Increased housing production has the most impact for the average renter, right? Someone that's making maybe 100% AMI, 80%, right? For those that are making less, 60%, all the way down to 30%, right? There's no relief for those people, right? If we were to able to see, again, what's happening in Austin, where, rents are nosediving 10%, that's still not helping everyone. That's still not getting to the entire crisis. And it's not providing short-term relief, right? Again, I want to have a complete upheaval of our zoning. I'm glad that last year we passed we did away with mandatory minimums for parking. These are policies, these kinds of EMB policies that, I support, I will vote for, I think we should continue to do. They impact housing production 5 to 10 years from now, right? And we cannot tell people that are in crisis right now, well, in 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a whole lot of more, affordable housing coming on the market. That's wholly inadequate, and we need every single tool at our disposal, and that's why I'm going to be supporting this.
Councilor Zarowski.
Thank you, Chair President Snake, not being a member of the committee. Ms. Chu, thank you for coming and speaking with us tonight. This was really informational. I was not aware of specifics in a compromise bill, and I think seeing that as a body is really important, because what you presented up there is substantially different from what was originally posed in Senate Bill 1447. I like the idea of giving Salem a little bit more ownership over this process, and I appreciate that. I think that's the meat of this resolution. I want to make sure we do it right, because there's a lot of nuances with this, and I've seen some really informed commentary from people who do this for a living, and I'm sure we'll hear from some people later tonight, that this isn't something you can just jump into and assume it's going to work. So I want to see this done mindfully. I had a couple questions about the compromise language. When you talk about, yes, thank you. It talks about all units in publicly subsidized mixed income projects. So does that mean if there's like a public-private partnership that would probably house low-income people affordably, does that mean that this doesn't apply to those kind of developments? Like, what's the threshold for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Basically, we are exempting all the units in like a LIHTC project or a subsidized project. We heard a lot of feedback, again, from folks like Harbor Light CDC and the other CDCs that just the way, well, we heard two things. One, it's difficult to regulate the unsubsidized units and not regulate the subsidized units. It's just mechanically difficult. So, we want to make sure affordable housing is truly affordable for residents, and we think there are ways we can't actually account for that here. And it honestly was always our intention with the nonprofit piece. We just clarified what that means, because we learned more from our CDC partners about, the for-profit entities they house some of the affordable housing in, but essentially, yes, because we just feel it's a different scheme, and we want to continue to support affordable and mixed income housing development, particularly not just, fully market housing development.
Do we have any idea how, like, we work with some great affordable housing partners like the CDC and like Beacon and like Harbor Light. Do we know how they feel about this?
I don't want to speak totally on the record, but I guess I will to say I do, and we can, I do believe through Mass Association of CDCs that Andrew DeFranza from Harbor Light has been supportive of some sort of compromise in this similar character, and then beyond that, there have been many partners who've been engaged. I can't say for sure about others, but I do know he's been actively supporting.
I can make some phone calls.
Yeah. He would be a great person to call. I think he would like to be
We're due
talking
for
more.
a chat
Yeah.
anyway, about other things too. I did want to point out the numbers about the rent increasing. I agree, that's a pretty stark increase of 34.8% over 5 years, but I believe that's from the housing roadmap from the city. And if you look at the numbers for owned properties over that same period of time, the median sale price for a condo went up 36.8%. The median sale price of a single family home went up 49.4%. And I think the problem with those numbers is that we're looking at post-COVID housing economy. And if you bought your house with a 2.95% interest rate, or if you had a loan that was super low at the beginning of COVID, of course your costs went up significantly during that 5-year time span. And that doesn't even account for things like materials costs and labor costs and tariffs and other things that impacted housing costs. So I appreciate that is a really big increase, but that's an increase across the board, and that's not just limited to people who rent. That's everybody. And if it's a single family home, it's way more than that. And I guess the rest of this is specific to the language in the resolution. So I don't know, are we going to have a separate discussion about that, or should I just talk about it now?
You can continue. You have the floor.
Thank you. So I think there are some inconsistencies between what we have in front of us as a resolution and what sounds like people support as a compromise. Like I'm looking at the cap of 5%. I'm looking at the language that says enact enabling cities and towns, because I kind of like some of the stuff that's in the compromise, especially since we just passed a debt exclusion, and this doesn't allow landlords to account for a significant increase in property tax. The language in the compromise that you had up there does. So if I had to pick one, I don't think I would pick the one that's on here, because I think that's a significant concern for a lot of people. And I think that covers everything at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor King?
Thank you, Chair Presnewski. I will say I actually have like amendments written out here that rectify that. So the main one I had was an amendment that strikes the with a cap of 5%, and then inserts, and I'll like read this out, but I'm not necessarily making that motion now. I'm open to feedback before I make the official motion, but it would read the sentence as including limiting annual rent increases based on a formula accounting for the consumer price index. So just something that is a formula that includes inflation, essentially. As to the piece about like the legislation entitled Enact Enabling Cities and Towns, I think the only reason I didn't strike that and replace it with something is because there isn't another thing to replace it with, because again, like it could be just amendments to this, it could turn into something else. I'm open to just saying in support of legislation for rent stabilization in Massachusetts. That I'd be fine with that, just making it something that's even more generic, because I think that I'd be fine with that if others would be fine with it, something like that. Or rent stabilization in Massachusetts with a local option, right? Something that really gets at the core meat of what this bill does. But definitely open to those edits. I have some other thoughts, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. And any amendments can be added at the at the end, and then we can vote on that at the end after listening to the rest of the council and also to the public comment. Councilor Sidoriak?
Thank you, Chair Presnewski. I'm glad that we're bringing up different research. So full disclosure, I'm an economist in land use. And I'm wondering if you've been able to look into the 2024 meta-analysis of rent control studies. There's about 112 studies that they looked at. Over 80% of them are not only empirical, but peer-reviewed and unbiased. And here's some of the things that it says that I think some of the other research isn't getting at. that increases in rents for uncontrolled units will happen because of rent control. And so that would be those units that are exempted for that 5 to 15 period, whatever is chosen. That rent regulation severely degrades housing quality, and almost always maintenance outpaces the allowable rent increases. It financially incentivizes individuals to over-occupy or under-occupy spaces relative to their actual demographic needs, locking out people who would like to move here. Landlords systematically pull properties out of the rental ecosystem, converting existing apartments into owner-occupied luxury condominiums or just private co-ops. And that's regardless if you have a condo conversion ordinance. And then essentially it sort of prevents and stalls new construction because the sort of the cost, it outweighs the investment. So I was wondering, have you seen this meta-analysis of all these studies?
I don't know if I've seen that particular one. I've certainly, been working with economists and researchers we have around this. I think one problem is just not everything that's called rent control are actually quite different. And so, yeah, I think some of the question is which scheme. I mean, Oregon and Washington State passed statewide that are much more like our compromise, and I don't think there's been as much research on those versus a lot of those studies that I'm familiar with are talking about a New York City, a San Francisco, who have kind of what we call first generation rent control schemes, and we've been calling these more like second, third generation rent stabilization.
Yeah, so I encourage you, and I'm happy to send this to you, I'm happy to send it to any of the counselors. So the meta-analysis that aggregates 112 studies over 50 years from places all around the world touches on more than just the sort of old rental control, also touches on the stuff we're talking about today. And I think that's really important for all of us to consider when we are looking at this, because I'm hearing a lot of these studies. I'm finding studies that say that rent control doesn't do this. That's not necessarily true. This is the most comprehensive study there is on rent stabilization, rent control, and it should be considered when we're creating policy. So highly encourage you to look at it.
Yeah, I agree. And I would just say, though, I still think that, I think I haven't seen that coming out of Oregon. I haven't seen that coming out of some of these places that have implemented more recently. So I would just like to, I do just think that not all rent control policies are created equal. And we're not talking about New York City.
Yeah, so it'd be really important to look at all of them and kind of aggregate their conclusions to see, on average, what does it look like, right?
Yes, and what does a policy like ours, how does that track over time? That's kind of what I'm interested in, not what does San Francisco's policy do over 50 years is kind of a different conundrum that they're in than what does a policy similar to ours do over a period of time. I do think some of the New Jersey policies are a little different, but some are a little closer. Again, I think Montgomery County, Maryland's a little closer. Oregon, yeah.
Well, I highly encourage you to take a look at it because it does look at a wide range of empirical, unbiased research on places that are similar to Massachusetts, and something really important to look at. We want to make sure we're using data decision-making when creating policy that could honestly lock people out and make the housing crisis worse.
I think we really believe that this is one piece of doing multiple things to help alleviate the housing crisis. And, this is really both rooted in data, but also like what we see every day on the ground in cities like Lynn, in Salem, where renters are just seeing exorbitant rent increases and have nowhere to go because of it.
Well, I look forward to policies that help build more housing. I think that is the most important and effective way to be able to lower prices for our renters. And thank you, Chair.
Councilor Lapa.
Thank you, Chair Presnewski. This is a great conversation. I'm having fun. I'm going to speak for a minute just about what I would like to see and what I plan to do. So I would like to see us pass this tonight. I would like to see it referred to the council and approved and sent to the legislature. I'd love to see the legislature pass something that would let us have a conversation, probably several years from now, where we can talk about how something like rent stabilization would fit in with the myriad of zoning changes that we will all be doing and championing, and how we can talk about transportation and a myriad of other things that can really address some of these problems. So every time that I see Mayor Pangalo over the next lifetime of mine, I'm going to be bugging him about zoning. And I would encourage all of you to do that as well, because that is how we can really get some stuff done. I don't think it'll happen fast enough to help people pay their rent, which is why I think something like this is important. Thank you.
Councilor Smith?
Thank you, Chair. Just point of clarification, are we still at question and answer, or should we move on to discussion?
We're on question, answer, and discussion. The council.
I did have some things to say, but I just want to make sure that Carolyn isn't up here too long in case, so if other folks have questions, I'll yield for that for now.
Councilor King?
Thank you, Chair Presnewski. I have comments, sorry. I will say all of these questions that have come up and concerns and thoughts are really exemplify like the statement that I think I loved to make a lot last year, and a lot of you also love to make on the campaign trail, that housing is not a silver bullet. There's no one solution to solving the housing crisis. And there's a lot of nuance to every decision that is made. And that's actually one of the biggest benefits that we have to the fact that the legislature is taking a serious look at this, and they are seriously considering some version of the bill that makes the most sense for balancing all of these like competing priorities that we have as communities. So I'm sad that the ballot question got struck down personally, but there is this like huge silver lining that now the legislature really gets to create something that like truly does help address all of the very valid concerns that people in this room have and all the nuance. So I think that the fact that the ballot question was so strongly supported by 69% of Massachusetts residents before it was struck down is really, that momentum is what's pushing the legislature to get this all the way to Ways and Means. As someone who watches a lot of bills go through the State House, Medicare for All, ranked choice voting, things like that, getting something to Ways and Means is a really big deal. Like getting it out of committee and not having it be sent to study, AKA dead, is a really big deal. So it might not happen this cycle, it might not, but I do think that this is, if you talk to people who work on other types of legislation statewide, that would be seen as like a big burst of momentum, right? Almost 70% of Massachusetts residents support something. It got to Ways and Means. That is really good momentum for something, and it would be the appropriate time for a city who would benefit from having the right to choose to say something and put a resolution out and be like, look, this has got some momentum. We want to support the idea of this continuing forward through the legislature. I also will just add, I absolutely, hands down, agree with all of the statements that we also need to build more. I would love to see sweeping zoning reform. I would love to see more buildings all over Salem. I think the big fear that a lot of our community members have when we talk about building more is gentrification. People are really worried that we are going to build more and they are going to have to move out of their neighborhood because the rents are going to spike because a nice apartment building went in next door and now the market rate for the whole neighborhood went up. That is probably the most serious concern I hear from people when we talk about building a lot more. So yes, this is not the only silver bullet to solve displacement, but it definitely would help to have it in our toolbox. And again, that is why it was the #1 priority of our 30 priorities in the Salem Housing Roadmap, was to have this in our toolbox and have the city have the option to have rent stabilization. We obviously do have other things that we've done to help with displacement. We do have a condo conversion ordinance that is fairly progressive. I would love to see us regulate Airbnbs, but that's a different conversation for not this committee meeting. So I think that this is just all part of a comprehensive zoning, housing, anti-displacement conversation, and I agree. I'm really happy we're having it, and I think it should inspire us all to work on other things that also help build more housing. And I'll just end with, this is like at the end of the day, like we can talk all day about economics and things, but this is also about like our community and the people who live here, and them being able to continue to live here and be part of our community. My father lived in Cambridge for 20 years in Cambridgeport. He loved his rent-controlled apartment. And he had to leave because of rent when the ban was lifted, or the ban was put in place in 1994. And that's actually why I exist, because my parents moved in together because of him having to be displaced from his Cambridge apartment. So I'm not grateful for that, because I wish that I don't know, that my dad had more options and had not been forced to leave his community where he had lived for 20 years, right? Like that. It's a real issue that really impacts people here today. People want to live here. They want to be in their community. They want their kids to stay in their schools for their whole childhood. So we have to take it seriously and at least have the option on our plate.
Councilor Tarowski?
Thank you, Chair Presniewski. Presniewski, not being a member of the committee, there was a line early on, corporate real estate investors are driving up housing costs. Do we have an idea in Massachusetts how much new development is backed by corporate developers versus by private entities? Because those people have a lot more money and time and resources to fight that fight. And if you're proposing a 3-unit property on a small footprint lot, it's really easy for local people to shoot that down at the city level even. So how much of that is coming from, and maybe you don't, that's something I'd like to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think because there's both corporate real estate investors and landlords and new development, but there's also what we see a lot of too is corporate and like large corporate actors buying up existing properties, and so I think they are like for the purpose of broad messaging, I've kind of combined it, but I would say they're actually slightly different issues, and we should just think about both what it, kind of what kind of entities are building in our communities, and are they kind of good community actors, and how do we support local people to be building, and then also what do we do about the large number of corporate actors, out-of-state actors who are buying existing multifamilies and then, jacking up the rent, not doing any repairs, and that is also a big issue we see. So on that, there's MAPC put out a report, Homes for Profit, I believe, a few years ago, that you can look by census tract around LLC ownership. I will say, as a caveat, LLC ownership is not a perfect substitute, because there are a lot of small actors who also have LLCs, but I do believe they're doing some additional research right now, but that's a good place to start.
Thank you. I'll look into that. Appreciate it.
Councilor Smith?
Thank you, Chair Presniewski. So I just had some comments as well on this. I'm a landlord. My wife and I have a place in Boston. I'll out myself on that. It's just on a side note, it's unconscionable to think that you would go up 10% a year and that not be enough. Year over year, if people know the 72 rule, 10% a year means that in 7.2 years, the amount of that rent would double as it compounds. As it compounds, yeah, the interest compounds. That would be the gains would compound. That to me is nuts. I mean, think about where you would be in 7 years. A $2,000 apartment is now $4,000, and 7 years later it's $8,000. It's a lot. This is not, this piece of paper here, I love holding things up. A lot of statistics that we don't need to necessarily disagree with. We just get to this piece at the end that it sounds like Councilor King has some fantastic amendments for that I would certainly support. But it's not about rent control. It's only about, and I said this the other night, local control. It's about the fact that we know Salem, and I know which landlord on Essex Street isn't fixing the heat. I know which landlord on Northeast Street has his trash everywhere. These are real people, by the way, and you've just been outed. The fact is that there are things that we know that the state, that a blanket state bill cannot take into account. There are things that corporate landlords setting their own rates cannot take into account. And there are things that, as the Ward 3 councilor said, the Cato Institute cannot tell us, because that's where that study came from. And so we need to be able to set our own policy here in Salem to do what's best for Salemites. And we have to be able to do it where we can then take it off if it doesn't work. I know that's not what people want to hear. But the fact is that a larger thing moving, a huge statewide initiative might be more difficult. But if we had that local control, which we're supporting with this piece of paper, then we are free and flexible to try this demand side resolution for what is rising rents. We've got the supply side. We're building housing better than almost anybody. We're doing that, and we're subsidizing that, and we're making that possible in a lot of ways, and I think we will continue to make that possible through the zoning changes and other things that we're going to be looking at in the next couple years. But it's still not making that dent. It's still not letting seniors live here. It's still not letting people stay in this community who are already here. It's bringing new people in, great. But we also have to take care of the folks that live here and can't make the rent. And there's a lot of people that live downtown outside. They're on Riley Plaza. They're not counted in the statistics. We don't know what they're paying for rent because they're out of doors and they're not involved in that. And that might also get people back into housing, which is incredibly important. I believe in this. I believe in rent stabilization. I believe so much in rent stabilization that I'll take a moment of personal privilege to just say happy anniversary to my wife. I'm probably going to duck out of here in a few minutes during public comment, and I apologize. I should probably do that, but I wanted to make sure that I got this, was here for this, because this is incredibly important. It means a lot to people that are sitting around the room that we let Salem choose and that we take back the power and don't shirk our responsibilities as counselors. That's what this is about. It doesn't matter what's on the piece of paper. What matters is that we are taking responsibility and we are collectively going to try to make lives better for people that live here. Thanks.
Councilor Sidoriak.
Thank you, Chairperson Newski. So I want to just speak to some of the procedural stuff. There is nothing for certain that is going to come out of the legislature. And I think it's really important when we use our voice through resolution that we are certain that we are aligned together as counselors, and that is not what's going to happen here. We're going to possibly pass this with not all the counselors on board for a bill that does not exist. And the things that are being cited here are some of the most restrictive rent control in the country. And the research predominantly says that it will have a negative impact and reduce housing. And the reason why prices are expensive right now is because there's not enough housing. So I think it's really important to think about how we wield our resolutions so that it does not dilute them in the future. And perhaps we can come back to this when there's actually something that can come out of session this session. That isn't just, we hope you pass something. We hope that the sort of soul of what we'd like for you to achieve is there. And in regards to local control, it's local control is great, but if there isn't an option that's well defined, we're not really giving Salem voters an option. We have to make sure that we understand the option that we do provide them so they can have that control. So for me, I don't believe I can support something that isn't well defined so that we know exactly what we're speaking to. And I understand that we can write a resolution where we support something in concept or through some sort of philosophy, but I think that really pulls back the impact and influence that our resolutions can have. And so, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. If there's no further discussion on the council, I will now open it up to public comment. Thank you, Caroline, for your presentation. You may.
Thank you all for having me. Yeah.
So if we can start on the left side of the room, if somebody wants to get up, please state your name and your address if you choose to do so. And please try to keep your public comments down to about 3 minutes. I'll try to accommodate as much of everybody as we possibly can. I know that you folks here in the room and in the Zoom land have listened to all the councilors and kind of understand where everybody stands. So there's no reason to pontificate things that we've already made decisions on. So if you have something to say that you think is important, please go right ahead.
Jeff Cohen, 12 Hancock Street. Speaking in support of the resolution. I'm going to start out by saying, just responding to a couple of things Councilor said. One is the health and safety of units is up to the city, health department, and building department. And we have a lot of robust ordinances that we've passed in the last few years. Second of all, before I was a councilor, I wrote 7 resolutions that all passed. And then when I became a councilor, I realized they're non-binding. But I really support resolutions that tell legislative bodies at the state and federal level what our intent is. And they don't have to be unanimous. Hardly anything is that may be contentious. You know, as Councilor King said, everyone on the campaign trail talked about housing and we don't have enough affordable housing. So I looked at every one of your campaign pitches, and I'm just going to repeat a couple of them. As Salem's Ward 3 councilor, I will work hard to improve our community's quality of life, advocate for policies that help our neighbors afford to live in Salem, and protect our most vulnerable populations. And the Ward 1 councilor, our housing costs increase much more quickly than those of other local cities and towns, leading to unaffordable rents and mortgages and the very real possibility of becoming unhoused. And I ask those 2 councilors, as well as everyone else, what you've submitted to the council this year to improve the affordability of housing. And if you don't have anything for Thursday's meeting, I suggest you have 9 weeks to put something together. Now I'm going to tell you what I really came for, and that is the bullshit of housing production myth. And let me tell you why from a personal perspective. When I got out of college,
Councilor Cohen, just curb the line.
the Supreme Judicial Court said, Chair, that we can use language like that. In the 80s, when I got out of college, I was lucky enough to buy a 3-family in Cambridgeport, and it was during rent control. For people who don't know, when rent control existed, it was 3 communities, Boston, Brooklyn, and Cambridge. I had a tenant who paid $250 a month. I never raised the rent. I paid for all my expenses with rents and sold that property and bought a single-family home. In 2009, I bought a 3-family in Salem. And I still own that. These are the properties I've owned have always been owner-occupied. I have never charged a tenant less than 28 to 50% under market. Almost 70% of my tenants are at 50% of the current market, and 60% of my tenants since I purchased the property have been housing insecure. My intent has always been to provide a safe and comfortable home for people who are survivors, trans, non-binary, undocumented families. For all the properties that I've owner-occupied, I have never once raised the rent. In every situation, I have paid for all my expenses, mortgages, taxes, insurance, renovations. In my current property on Hancock Street, I've put over $250,000 into the property, never raised the rent, never used a penny outside of my income from rent. In 2009, the fair market rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in Salem was $1,146. If you look at Rent Cafe, which is a great site, which updates the market rates every single month, as of July 2nd of this month, the market rate for a 1-bedroom in Salem, $25.26. That's a 220% increase since 2009. That's enough that if I charged the market rent, I could buy everyone's home who lives in this place that owns their own single family. And I say this because property owners, landlords have all all the advantage, all of it. The reason we passed the condo conversion regulation, which isn't strong enough, doesn't give the tenant enough money, the reason we did that is because investors are making it impossible for working families to buy multi-unit buildings. Imagine this, a working family buys a three-family, they use 2 of the apartments rent, and they pay about the same or less for their mortgage and expenses than they would in a 2-bedroom apartment. Isn't that the goal we should have? The people who are getting screwed in our community are the renters. Okay, 100%. They're at it. You know, I've had renters that have done horrible things in my property that I've spent a lot of money making it safe. The hate crime that was committed against me was by a tenant. And yet, at some point, I can get a new tenant. And under the current rules, I can charge anything I want. And everyone on my street, when the buildings, multi-unit buildings were purchased, every single one of those tenants is gone except for one. And their rent in 2 years has gone from $1,600 to $3,500. And if you've been on Hancock Street, it's not Beverly Hills, okay? So I invite you to pass this resolution and then actually come up with some other stuff by the first meeting in September. Thank you.
Just point of order, can Chair just remind the room that we can't have any personal attacks on counselors or people in the room or otherwise. I know I said something earlier, it was a vague reference to a whole long street, but the specificity of that is probably should not be tolerated.
Correct.
And to hold the time, please.
Hello, my name is soon-to-be Dr. Josiah Guthrie, and I just wanted to engage a little bit with how academic work has been discussed and engaged with here. I sometimes describe it as a conversation in, quote, Lord of the Rings. So Treebeard says, anything that you say in Old Entish takes a long time to say, and anything that you say in Old Entish is worth taking a long time to say. And I think that really describes academia. There were some papers mentioned earlier, one that was published in 2024, that was almost certainly written in 2023 over the course of like 1 to 2 years using data from 1 to 10 years prior to that. And it's also just one piece of data, or one paper. A meta-analysis is a style of paper that tends to analyze a realm for particular factors. It's, you know, that meta-review was certainly pared down to those 112 studies using very specific keywords. You kind of search through databases, narrowing for specifically what you're looking for. And I also kind of want to echo some of the sentiment that Councilor Davis mentioned earlier, which is that as this is a conversation, it evolves over time. It changes as the times change. There was mention of, you know, we're in a post-COVID economy now. Maybe some things work a little bit differently in that time. And I think as I have done my own literature review and looking through the literature on this, I have found that we've really crystallized in a place that is closer to what was presented to us today and what some counselors have said, which is that this isn't meaningfully going to, you know, reduce the housing construction. And I also believe that we need so much of that anyways, that the articles and the history of this impacting that is so minuscule compared to what we need to do already, that if we have any hope of meeting the challenge before us, we need to overcome any possible harm that may come from this already. And that's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Alexandra Pinheiro-Shields, 7 Bristol Street. When I was in 3rd grade, I could see the flashing lights from the Empire State Building from a little window next to my pillow. It was magical. My parents, my brother, and I were living in an attic because my parents could no longer afford the rent in our apartment in Queens. I hated leaving PS 84 and my beloved teacher, Miss O'Connell. My parents had emigrated to the United States with my brother and me, and even though they were college educated, after a few years, their savings were gone. And they found themselves in danger of being homeless. We were taken in by an Irish-American family in Brooklyn with 4 young children, and they invited us into their attic. A few years later, after having gotten ourselves back on our feet, we were homeless again, and a Colombian immigrant family invited us to share the basement apartment they had as a benefit of being the custodians in a large apartment building. The real magic and awe was not that I could see the Empire State Building as I fell asleep every night, but rather that these 2 families, even though they had limited means, had a sense of abundance, not scarcity, a sense of abundance and community. And I have witnessed that abundance and community here in Salem. I know several Salem families who have opened their homes to people in danger of homelessness. These families understood the need of people who were desperate and in danger of being homeless because the rents were too high. One family took in a person who had lost their job because of a disability. Another family who has been here in Salem for several generations took in an immigrant mother and child. You all know people in town who have opened their homes for someone else for a week, a month, or longer to help others. That's who Salem is. We are compassionate and we welcome the other because of our history, which has made us very clear about the dignity of each and every human being. So, in closing, I want to remind us that Massachusetts ranks, depending on the study, either the 3rd or 4th richest state in the United States, and yet we have a housing crisis. And the lack of the decision by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court gives us an opportunity to solve this problem ourselves for our community, as has been already said. We can choose abundance, we can choose community over profit. We can control Salem's destiny and maintain Salem for working class people, for working class families. So I urge you to pass this resolution in favor of a local option for rent stabilization. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Alex Brumfield. I live on 289 Essex Street, apartment 203. Thank you, councilors, for your time and consideration tonight. I will keep my remarks somewhat brief. I myself am fortunate that my rent costs me just 1/3 of my monthly income, and I consider myself incredibly fortunate in that regard, and that's only because I live with my partner. And I first moved here so that I could afford to finish my last year of grad school in Boston, because God knows I was not affording that. As many in this room, I believe that housing is a human right, and like our presenter made clear, there is not a silver bullet, one-size-fits-all solution to the housing crisis. But that is exactly why there should not be a blanket prohibition of any form of a policy that can deliver immediate relief for cost-burdened renters and marginalized folks that are most at risk of losing their housing. Most working families don't get cost of living adjustments to their wages and salaries. Massachusetts minimum wage has not increased in 3 years, and yet everyone here, I think, can attest that the prices have not remained exactly constant in that time. And to reiterate, like has been said several times tonight, the resolution that you're being asked to vote on is in support of the legislation allowing for local control over rent stabilization policies in Salem. It is not the rent stabilization itself. And to those in this chamber who might be wary of taking action without discussing substantive policy with care and precision, I will congratulate you for holding yourself to a higher standard than our state legislature has. This This bill has been in the legislature for a while, and the movement that we've seen right now is because of the tireless work of Homes for All and of the tenant advocates behind the ballot initiative. It should not take a resolution from city councils and town councils to convince the State House to act in the interest of the people. But that's just kind of where we are right now. And Councillor Sidoriak brought up important studies that we should consider, and there is a place for that in this room with local control over the outcome. So I ask that you use your voice, tell the State House to do their job, and vote yes on this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Council. My name is Ethan. I live over on 12 Lincoln Road. I grew up in Lynn and in Salem. 5 of us crammed into this 2-bedroom apartment. I've slept in a lot of cramped spaces and a lot of couches throughout my life. And I've seen my parents fall behind very frequently on rent, having to choose between the rent and putting food on the table and paying the heat. And so I've known a lot of times where my mom would stop eating because we were months behind on rent and it seemed to keep going up. Or where I would have to wear 3 jackets in order to do my homework or go to bed in my house because we couldn't put the heat on in the winter anymore. And this, I think, is a very deeply personal issue for people of my generation and for the parents of my generation, as this housing crisis has grown and grown and grown. I mean, I think from the 1980s, something like 300% is the increase in housing prices, and wages and inflation have not nearly matched that. A lot of that, I think, is greed and these people finding that they can gouge and they can suck more money out of the system. And so, as this remains a very deeply personal issue, I think that we need all the tools possible on the table in order to solve it. We need, of course, to do zoning reform, and we need to do this in conjunction with other options, but this is a tool necessary in order to get people the solutions and the results that they need now, to make their lives more affordable now, to make lives possible now. These rising costs continue to rise, and they're already very high to begin with, and they're a real issue, and we can't keep running from change. I think we have this problem in this country. We're so afraid of these new solutions. You talk about something like this, you're always going to be able to find some study from the Cato Institute that says if you do this, the sky will fall, the ground will fall out from under you. But that's not true. This is a compromise solution that we've seen up here where it's 10%. 10% is a very, very profitable margin for a lot of landlords to be able to raise every year. I mean, if we endorse something like that, it is still incredibly easy. These landlords are not silly. They have not put themselves in a situation where they can't make money. They're very powerful. They did not come together with the governor and with the state legislature and agree on a number that makes them run out of business. This is a number that makes sense, and they will not be out of business because they cannot raise rents on families like mine 20% every year and evict us or make us homeless. And so I think this is something very important that you should consider very deeply. And it matters a lot. It matters a lot to the families of Salem that we balance the interests of the landlords, because of course you have a responsibility to make sure that they're still building in this, but you do not have a responsibility to maximize their profits and enable them to maximize their profits. So please choose the people of Salem over that. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jeremy Mealy, he, him. I live on 8 Flying Cloud Lane in Salem. And I wanted to take a moment to talk about my support for the resolution before the committee. Many people will rightly understand this resolution as one supporting rent stabilization. As I say, that's mostly true, but in a sense it's also putting the cart before the horse. Even should this resolution ultimately pass, it simply signals to Beacon Hill that we here in Salem want a choice. We want a voice. We want democracy. After all, this legislation is not a rent control mandate, it's not a statewide rent freeze, it is instead a returning of power to local communities, that is, cities and towns. It would allow us at the local level to decide what measures we want to explore to bring and or keep down housing costs. That power should be in our hands, even if we don't decide to use it. This is what democracy is about, entrusting the voters and their elected representatives to take the steps they think are best to promote the common good. I know some, perhaps a majority, of the councilors here in Salem do not support rent stabilization. As we've heard, they have facts and figures they'd cite to back up their arguments, just as we, on the pro-rent stabilization side, have facts and figures to back up ours. I think that this is a critically important issue that deserves to be aired out, with all sides bringing their perspective to bear. That cannot happen, however, if we are prevented by state law from meaningfully debating this topic and taking steps to implement what we democratically decide to do. Perhaps Salem residents and or their locally elected representatives on the council would ultimately reject rent stabilization. I think that would be a mistake, but I would be content if we were at least allowed the chance to decide for ourselves how we want to react to the housing crisis. Rents are too damn high, and people are being priced out of our community and sometimes onto the streets. This is an untenable situation, and we should be working towards a solution. And we should be allowed to have many tools, such as rent stabilization, at our disposal to do with as we see fit. This is what the resolution urges, and that is what I support. The time for debating rent stabilization will come, but for now, I urge the City Council to tell Beacon Hill, let Salem choose. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Reese. I live on Derby Street. Me and my partner have lived together for like 9 years and had to move like almost every single one of those years because rent would just go up at the end of every year and then we'd have to find somewhere else. And we have been very privileged to be able to stay in Salem for 3 years, only having had to move once because rent changed. And you know, good luck getting rid of us because we love it here. It's a really beautiful community and we have built a lot here and we've made a lot of friends that I don't want to have to see get priced out. I think we're all aware that like we're in a terrible housing crisis and we need tools. Tenants don't really have tools. We don't really have rights. And this is just like one step of hopefully many to get us just a couple of rights, which would be really awesome. So please let this move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is David Betancourt. I live on 5 Heritage Drive in Ward 4 in Salem. I'm going to start kind of from personal and build out in my argument. Personally, I probably spend around or over 1/3 of what I earn on rent, and I live with my brother. My brother, because of the situation of this, just the state of Massachusetts, is contemplating move with his boyfriend to a place like Arizona or New Mexico, which is not good for climate change going forward. So the fact that people would have to try to make that kind of decision to move to a place like that and maybe try to start a life there is not good. I have a personal friend who has lived in Watertown. He lived in Watertown for a long time. I helped him move there in 2019, right before COVID. He lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. From 2019 to 2025, his rent increased 3 times, like tripled in the cost. I think part of the reason why this happened, I'm one of those nerds who stares at like housing all the time, dreaming about trying to ever afford a house. A part of it, I think, is basically landlords en masse decided as a market rent decision post-COVID to take 1-bedroom apartments and set them at a price mark that would work for couples and not for single individuals. Because when you look especially at housing, you see the increase in prices from a studio apartment to a 1-bedroom is a massive jump versus a 1-bedroom to a 2-bedroom apartment. And to me, that's the only logical reason that that would have happened in that time period. And I think it brings back also to what the member over there whose name I can't remember mentioned, which was saying in 2011 or whatever that you had 1,100 and then it goes up to 2,500 by 2025. Why would have such a jump because of that type of policy? And I mean, my friend is, right before he moved, he had his sister have to move in with him, and after that, now he lives with his mother again. And I think at a larger level, what this is getting at is basically the federal government, when we're looking at the studies that people have brought up, like the council in Ward 3 or what Davis has brought up with how there was no change in his study and that there's various changes in what Ward Thor's member from Ward 3 has brought up. I think the important thing to remember is that on a larger scope, the federal government has not put any money behind major housing or other types of policy initiatives since the time of Nixon. They have not tried to do anything ambitious, especially in cities. And this means, and when we're looking at studies from 50 years, Nixon is prior prior to 50 years, which means we are seeing and looking at studies of housing in the United States without any federal guidance. And we've seen where that's left us. It's put us in this situation where there's not enough housing throughout the entire country. And this is basically the case of neoliberalism. And we compare it to the United States since the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, which I just read, the United States implemented rent control throughout the entire country. And they did that from 1942 until 1953, and the state of Massachusetts upheld that until 1955 when it was vetoed. And we all know that from 1945 to 1953, there was a huge expansive growth in housing throughout the United States. And that's just a basic fact. And we also see that, you know, in this policy, and as I said, the differences of why there hasn't been a lot of like growth, you know, between different types of communities that did have rent control and didn't have rent control is once again because the federal government just has not put anything in. And to try to narrow this down, I think a part of it is, and we all know that currently the federal government is not doing anything to deal with this at all. They're, you know, the federal administration is far more interested in graft and theft and stripping the copper wiring from our nation and not helping the common people. So that means now it comes down to the state level to try to fix this problem. And when they can't fix it, then it comes down to the local level. And we're, as a local community, trying to say, you know, through this resolution, that we want our state house to fix housing in this state and to help work towards that. And as I said, trying to get back to what I was saying too a little bit earlier, I think that's part of the reason why, like, housing prices, actually I can't remember my point, but basically with housing crisis, it's, I mean, housing, like why it hasn't increased at the levels of the 1950s and 1960s is because of lack of federal assistance. But anyway, so I think basically it comes down to we need to support this resolution as a town, and I think we need to show the State House that we want this to happen because it's a part of the component of trying to convince it, because then if all these states are doing this and this is doing good things, this might convince the federal government to be able to get back into the game of housing and help all our communities. Thank you.
Good evening, councilors. Christine Medor, 20 Federal Street, Unit 8. I'm speaking as a Salem resident, not as an employee of Massachusetts Housing Partnership. So I'm really happy to be in a room where I believe all of us agree that we have a housing crisis, a housing shortage in Salem, and we all want to do something about it. However, I don't see that agreement being reflected on this resolution set before the council tonight. I'm hearing a lot about local option. Yes, local option is great. Those are the tools that you can wield to drive really great outcomes. You also have power now locally to change your zoning. I really wish we were spending all this time to be discussing a zoning amendment, and if we don't have time to devote to those zoning amendments, I would like to see the resolution to speak to other bills specific to housing affordability that is actively going through the legislation, and instead of cherry picking on rent stabilization. I'm talking specifically about Yes in My Backyard that allows specific density by right. I'm talking about reducing parking minimums, which is also in the YIMBY bill, which you can enact by filing something this week, if not next week. Completely eliminate parking minimums in our zoning, not just for a specific part of the city. You can do that immediately. That will have huge impact on the cost and the speed to build housing in Salem. You can do that without a resolution that may or may not have power, may or may not pass the legislation. You can also have the resolution include language around YICBI, yes in God's backyard. I remember very clearly the trauma that this council went through several years ago just to allow churches and schools and public buildings to build housing in their vacant surplus land. I believe Councilor Flynn might remember that as well. That was rough, but we got it done. That is going to have statewide impact if the YICBI bill passes. I believe it got some momentum just this afternoon. Put that in the resolution. Site plan review, put that in the resolution. Site plan review, if we standardize that statewide, developers don't have to play a guessing game depending on which community they are building. We have 351 cities and towns. Each and every one of them, including Salem, have our own set of zoning and ordinances and bylaws that dictate how and where to build. If we're asking every city and town to come up with rent stabilization ordinances or bylaws, that's another layer to navigate. And because the rental market is regional by nature, developers might potentially have to navigate a patchwork of regional markets that they have to go back to their drawing board, calculate the numbers, may or may not pencil out. And that's another layer of complication that they'll have to understand in order to make their return. And as we know, public entities don't build housing, developers do. So, like I said, there's a lot that you can do immediately, and this resolution is only speaking specifically about rent stabilization, but there's a lot more you can add to the resolution that doesn't lock people into positions where you're forcing each other, your own colleagues, to say whether you're for or against rent stabilization. The language as is too prescriptive, too broad brush strokes to apply to Salem. We all heard that Salem needs its own specific ordinance to make it right size for us. The language as it stands in the bill does not do that. You have the power to change that, and I hope you consider either keeping this in committee or voting it down. I get a sense that this will likely pass, maybe not unanimously, and I think it's great if you send a message, if it is unanimous to the legislation, that has a lot more gravity and weight if it's unanimous. But with the resolution itself right now, I think it has a lot of room for improvement. I'm pretty confident that our legislative delegation, they know that this is an important issue for everyone in Salem. I believe they've been working hard at it, but just specifically asking them to pass this one resolution is not going to solve all of our problems. This is a problem that requires a scalpel, many scalpels, and not just a hammer. So thank you.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. Elena Eimert, speaking as a resident. I'm a renter, 260 Washington, Unit 23. I am one of the many, many rent-burdened, cost-burdened renters in this community. I know for a fact that I pay 38% of my income toward my housing costs, and that will certainly be higher this month with the heat wave, because it's intended to also include your utilities. And I know that I am so far from the most vulnerable person in this community. I work an email job. That means I'm relatively secure, and I still experience that ask of my income in securing my housing here in Salem. I had to recently make a decision to sign that lease, and I wanted to be here so badly. I just said, okay, that's a cost I can absorb. I want to acknowledge the, I think, really robust conversation we're having in this room, again, in recognition of the fact that people are really struggling and people really want to be here in Salem, and they want to be here in Salem in housing that is safe, in housing that is adequate, so they're not experiencing forced overcrowding or having to live in situations that fundamentally aren't safe. And I'm really, really glad that we have that consensus here tonight. And I'm also really concerned about what we might be moving forward with the resolution as currently drafted. I'm very, very heartened to hear Councillor King suggest that she would be open to amendments that speak more broadly about rent stabilization. The terms of the only existing bill, which is Senate Bill 1447, are really restrictive. I work in urban planning. I have served as a housing planner for this very city. I'm very, very committed to working on housing affordability and housing production, which is part of that conversation, as is housing stability. And the terms in S1447 are simply too restrictive. And so I look around this room and I see signs that say, let Salem choose. Well, the problem is, if we were to recommend this resolution, or if we were to recommend this resolution back to the legislature attached to the terms of the only current bill on rent stabilization that would return an option to this city that might really be unpalatable, because we would be put in a position to choose between rent stabilization, safe housing, and housing production. And I don't think that serves any of our desired goals. So I'd be very much in support of, should this resolution move forward, that language be amended to speak more broadly to housing production. The ED of Homes for All spoke about the sometimes referred to in this room compromise bill. I want to be really, really clear. There is no compromise bill. There is language around a compromise, and that language and the details in that language are much more similar to rent stabilization practices that are in place around the country, and that is precisely because they allow for renters to have some predictability over their housing costs, but they also don't stymie housing production, because we don't want to be in a situation where our renters are able to stay here, but in housing that is getting worse and worse in quality, and in a time of political instability and environmental crisis where we might want to welcome new neighbors, we are having to turn people away because we have limited housing production here. So those are some things that I'm really concerned about. Again, I just want to underscore that I would be in support of those amendments, and I also want to be very clear that I am completely in support of what the former Ward 2 Councillor Madore brought up this evening in terms of actions this council can take that would really make an impact. I will say it is the great thorn in my side that with parking reform we left out our 2 families. When you have a parking minimum of 3 spaces for a 2-family development, that is a real pain point, and so that prevents those really, gentle density projects from moving forward, and that is something this council could act on so soon. So now I'm wandering, but I just want to say thank you for the time tonight, thank you for the conversation, and I think again we all have this shared goal of keeping Salem home and allowing for new neighbors, and we just need to be really cognizant of the details of these policies because it really does matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Craig McGeehee, 323R Lafayette Street. I just want to start by saying that I'm in favor of the resolution, and not everything meaningful is measurable, and I think that's something that should be bared in mind. As a personal example, I have a family member who was driven out of their home because of domestic violence. We had to find them a new rental place. After 3 years, a new partner, and both of them having a job in the federal government, they've been driven out of Massachusetts to New Hampshire because they were not able to keep up with those constantly increasing rents. I think another thing we need to bear in mind is nothing exists in a vacuum. We are currently in unprecedented times as far as AI. I mean, just today we heard that 5,000 people were laid off from Microsoft with a plan to lay off at least 20% of a division. Every week we hear of layoffs because AI is constantly replacing jobs, and now landlords are actively using AI to find what is the pain point that they can charge for a rental unit before there's like that tipping point where people can't pay. Laws are constantly being chasing after what the situation is, and even this resolution is just a step to fix a problem 5 years that we should have solved 5 to 10 years down the line. And I think another thing to bear in mind is there's no end to any of these fights. If we are fighting for housing, rent stabilization, all that, even if this passes, the next day there's still a fight to get more housing, to get better stability to that rent stabilization. So I don't think that we should bear in mind that this is like a one fix, once it's done, it's done. This is just the next step before the next step before the next step. And I think this is a very important step just to kind of push this idea forward, that to bring it back down to say, like, we want people to have the choice, not just Salem, but other towns to have that choice to say what is best for their towns. Is this something they want to implement? And again, it's just saying we want to have that decision down the line. And if it comes out with the wording that we don't like, we can vote that down the line. But I don't want to make a decision against something that we don't even know when the contents of what they're working toward is something good, and then just to kill it dead before, or even this is like a means of pushing that forward, to say yes, the wording or the way it's phrased, we like that. It kind of reinforces the legislative side. So I'm in favor of it, is all I'll say.
Thank you.
All right, I'm Skylar Clark, 282 Derby Street, and I want rent control so bad it makes me look crazy. Basically, so when we hear about all this, like, we need new housing, it just reminds me of the story. One of my friends, Kendra, she was on the street. She is right now. She was one of the people removed from the Lifebridge Transition Center just earlier this week because she had an apartment that was in one of these new housing developments, and her rent was $2,700 a month. So without rent stability, without rent control, basically you are telling me that we need to build more housing, but that housing is going to be priced at rent, like market rates, which is $2,700 for a one bedroom. And this is causing the housing crisis. Like, this is the housing crisis. So basically it's that, and it's just the idea that, like, we need this so bad. Like, I was personally collecting signatures for this. If you guys, you've been getting my emails a lot this week, and if you can't even vote for a resolution to have a conversation 5 years from now, you cannot reply to my emails saying that you are in favor of housing reform. You cannot say that you support these policies to keep people housed if we can't even agree today to have a conversation later.
Anyone else in the room? Seeing none, we're going to go over to Zoom land to see if anyone has raised their hand. I do not see anyone raising their hand. Councilors, Councilor Davis.
Thank you, Chair Prosnowski. Not being a member of the committee, I just wanted to give a really sincere thank you to everyone that spoke. I feel very lucky and very moved to have so many folks speaking, whatever side you were on this. We have so many eloquent, passionate people in our community taking time out of their day to have this conversation with us tonight, and I think that's really amazing, and I think we owe it to the people in this room to have this conversation when the stakes are real. I think we owe that to everyone in this room, and we can vote against doing rent control in Salem then, but let's have that conversation and have that respect for our neighbors to have that conversation. What I propose, I really want to hear the amendments. I want us to pass those amendments, and I want us to pass this resolution tonight. I don't think that it has to be unanimous, but I think it would be incredible if it was, and I want to urge those that are still skeptical on this body, that's okay, and we can continue to have this debate. We can continue to bring the different studies that we found and continue to have that conversation in a real setting where the stakes are real. I really want us to do that. I think that'd be really great.
Councilor Lob.
Thank you, Chair Wozniacki. I guess I'll just speak my own thoughts about the process here. I really don't see a downside in us moving this forward. I think that we could always, down the road, say, you know what, the way that this bill, if anything even passes, right, the way that it worked out, maybe that's not for Salem. Maybe we have to figure out a bunch of other things to do in conjunction with it, right? There's future conversations that need to be had about how to do something like rent stabilization in a way that's not harmful, but we can't do any of that if the State House doesn't even pass a bill. And it's all right that there's not something specific right now, because that's what we're trying to use our voice to say, that we need there to be something. We can vote for this, they could create a bill that we don't like, and then we could not pass it later. We could vote for this and create a bill, and then we pass it later. We could not vote for this, and it's like this never happened. And we kind of wasted some time, which is fine. That's how politics works. So I'm planning to vote in favor of this. I recognize there's some complexity with how this would be implemented, but I don't think that's the point right now. I think the point right now is, can we even get the legislation to do something? And I think it's important that the City of Salem says, please do something. Please. Thank you.
Council President Merkel.
Thank you, Chair Prosnowski. Just a point of clarity that it appears Councilor Smith isn't in attendance, and I just wanted to point that out since he is on the committee before any amendments or voting moves forward. Just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you. Councilor King.
Thank you, Chair Prosnowski. I do want to echo the thank you to everyone who came and gave public comment. I felt that the room was very aligned on the long-term goal, and I got a lot of inspiration for more things we should be doing in addition. So thank you. I am going to make a motion. I'll make these I just have the two amendments, and I'll make them separately because discussion might be separate for the two of them. So my first amendment is to the whereas line that starts with whereas a proposed initiative petition for the November 2026 ballot. It's that line. It's the third from the bottom for counselors following on their paper. And the amendment I'd like to make is I would like to strike the words with a cap of 5%. And I would also like to insert after the word in the sentence, including limiting annual rent increases based on, right after on, I want to insert a formula accounting for the. So how that would read with that change would be, I'll read the whole line. Whereas a proposed initiative petition for the November 2026 ballot has been struck down by the Supreme Judicial Court, leaving only legislation currently under consideration by the Massachusetts legislature to seek to enable rent stabilization policies, including limiting annual rent increases based on a formula accounting for the consumer price index. And then it goes into the next whereas. So I move to make those amendments to the resolution.
Seconded.
Councilor King makes a motion to amend her whereas, which is the third from the bottom, to, as she stated, the changes being striking a cap of 5% and instead adding a formula accounting for the consumer price index. All those in favor of that amendment? I see 4 hands, including myself. Let it be known that Councilor Smith, who is part of this committee, had to leave early for a family matter. So that amendment passes. Councilor King.
Thank you. So my second amendment, and I would ask that there's discussion on this one just in case people have additional thoughts on it. Here's the phrasing I have. So this is for the last line on the front of the page, which is the first now therefore be it resolved. So the amendment I'm proposing is that we strike at the end of the sentence, we strike entitled an act enabling cities and towns to stabilize rents and protect tenants, and we replace it with in favor of lifting the ban on rent stabilization statewide. And then just for grammar reasons, the word legislation right there, the that's right in front of it, I'm just moving to strike that to the right in front of the word legislation to make it read correctly. The way that would read with that amendment would be, now, therefore, be it resolved that the Salem City Council hereby expresses its strong support for legislation in favor of lifting the ban on rent stabilization statewide. And then it goes into the next part.
Seconded.
On Councilor King's motion, is there any other discussion? Seeing none, so, I'm sorry, Councilor Lapa.
I think it's a great amendment. Thank you.
You did that on purpose to me. On Councilor King's motion to change the last sentence on the first page to say in favor of lifting the ban on rent stabilization statewide. All those in favor? All those opposed? Seeing 4 hands, including myself, that motion passes. Councilor King.
I move to recommend this resolution for a positive recommendation to the council at whole. I'm not sure if I phrased that correctly, but I'm moving to recommend this to the council for passage, first passage on Thursday.
Seconded.
Councilor King moves that this resolution be recommended positively at our next council meeting. Under discussion? Councilor Halapa.
Thank you, Chair Prosnewski. I appreciate the amendments. I think that makes this stronger. Again, like I've said a couple times, I'm okay with this not being incredibly specific about any legislation that does not exist yet. I think that's exactly the problem. I think we are trying to address a problem. It's a specific problem with a specific set of words, even though there's not a specific legislation tied to it yet. The whole point is that this will get that over the line. I'm in strong support. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Councilor Tarowski.
Point of clarification, if this is a resolution, it's only one passage, correct? It's not two passages?
Correct.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? Councilor King.
Thank you. I'll just say thank you to everyone who, all the councilors who attended this committee meeting. I do feel like this is one of those conversations where it went to committee and it ended up being a really productive conversation that I think we all learned a lot from each other. And I feel like this came out as a whole better because of the sum of its parts, which is the council. So thank you to you all.
On Councilor King's motion to send this back to the full city council with a positive recommendation, this resolution as amended. All those in favor? All those opposed? See, 3-4, 1 against. The matter passes. Do I have another motion?
I move to adjourn.
Councilor King moves to adjourn. All those in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you all. Thank you all in the audience for your participation also.